morning, everyone, and welcome to this Master IC. Thank the AIOS for considering this as top part of the program. The synopsis, as you all know, has already been put up, and residents in their formative years learn during the residency, and that will have a lasting impact. Minimize ಮಾಡ್ರಿ. Okay. That will have a lasting impact on their career. It therefore becomes a responsibility of the institutes offering residency programs to have a curriculum in place which is comprehensive and holistic. Hard skills are anyway taught to residents, but it is the empathy, soft skills, and humanity which are an integral part of healthcare, which the fellows deserve to learn. Management skills, right choice of equipment, and the technical aspects and marketing tools should ideally be part of the curriculum, which we are trying to offer in our institute. And with the help of experienced mentors, we are trying to provide a holistic menu to the budding practitioners. So the program has been divided into 5 topics. We have Dr. Apurva AG as the first speaker to tell us about guiding the residents to choose a specialty. Myself, I'll be speaking on clinical acumen building, the art and science, and if there is time at the end, the non-clinical essentials. And Dr. Krishna Prasad R and Dr. Srinivas Joshi will be speaking on their respective topics. So without much ado, I would like to first introduce Dr. Apurva. She is a VR consultant since 4 years at the MM Joshi Eye Institute, Hubli. Brilliant academic record she holds, being a topper in MS exams in the MAMC Delhi. And during her PG training and immediately post PG training also, she participated in several quiz programs and won awards and prizes. She's an excellent VR clinician, surgeon, and teacher. She's a thesis guide to most DNB students, highly inclined towards research. 42 publications and 4 book chapters is what she has to her credit at this young age. She has several presentations in conferences and on social media for lay public. And I think for the topic she has chosen, I have chosen for her guiding the resident to choose a specialty. She is the ideal selection. With this, I request Dr. Apurva to share her screen.
Yes, sir.
And start.
Kind introduction. I'll be
Slow.
about a fellowship, helping residents choose a fellowship. I hope you all like my talk. I have tried to make it very interesting and understandable, and I hope it will help residents in choosing and narrowing down to a fellowship. End of residency is a very daunting period in one's life, in one's academic career, because the daunting task of choosing the next step is looming. But one thing is clear at the end of residency, after speaking to a lot of residents and being a recent resident myself, we are pretty much clear about what we don't want. No offense to anybody, in my opinion, what I didn't want was what people don't want, not what I didn't want. There is no offense to anybody. Most residents don't want to take up squint, neuro-ophthalmology, oculoplasty, or pediatric ophthalmology. In my case, my choices for fellowship were retina and uvea, or squint and neuro-ophthalmology, and I was pretty clear about not wanting oculoplasty because there were too many surgical planes, very confusing, and cornea was too precise for my taste. So one thing we are clear about is what we don't want. When it comes to what we do want, what interests us, or what we envision for ourselves, it is difficult to choose. Like I said, I was interested in 4 subspecialties. I found it really helpful to answer these 4 questions. This is a questionnaire which I have borrowed from a concept which I'll be coming to at the end of this talk. All these 4 questions make you narrow down to one particular thing in which you can spend the rest of your professional life in. The questions are: what do I love? Am I good at it? Does my community need what I'm good at? And 4th, can I make money off of it? So coming to what I love, what do I love? Why do I love it? Do I have exposure to it? Have I developed love for it by reading? Is it because I got inspired by some seniors? or is it my personal calling? So what I love is either my passion or mission in life. So coming to interest or what I love because I got exposed to a particular specialty. This passion or loving for specialty can be got by either watching a well-equipped department at work, uh, watching, assisting, or doing surgeries in that specialty, seeing the outcomes, gratifying outcomes of these surgeries, looking at patient feedback and their perception of the specialty, and understanding the needs of this specialty finance wise. So, this passion is got by exposure. Coming to interest or passion got based on reading. This is very theoretical. When you go into nitty gritty of any specialty, you are bound to get interested in it. So again, that contributes to passion. Coming to inspiration by seniors, like my co-instructors here, especially the chief instructor, Dr. Guru Prasad, wanting to be like someone can be a very powerful motivation to get interest in that specialty. But we have to remember that everyone's journey may be different. So let us revisit this questionnaire. Now we know the reasons of why we love that specialty. Coming to the next question, am I good at it? This is a very tricky area because natural aptitude for something may be there, may not be there in many of the residents. A lack of a natural flair for diagnosing or operating in a particular specialty should not be deterring at the residency stage, because you may feel that you're not good at it, but later you can acquire this flair. So natural aptitude is not something you should base your specialty on. So coming to the next part of the diagram or the Venn diagram. Now we have looked at why I love something. Then we have that makes up for our passion. Coming to what we are good at can be our passion and profession, and being paid for it can contribute to the profession as well. So if we are good at something, we should never do it for free. So what can I be paid for it is something I should decide, or people should decide depending on the place where I settle. That is the scope of the specialty in that place. This should also not be a deterring factor, because we can, suppose somebody wants to take up retina, for example, in a big city like Mumbai, Bangalore, even Delhi, there are too many VR surgeons. Almost every street has a VR surgeon in metros, but that should not be a deterrent. Ideally, we need to identify the needs of that particular place and cater to them. One of the fellows I have interacted with in Bombay actually is a VR surgeon, a trained VR surgeon, and is from a small place in Gujarat, and he's now catering to ROP in most of rural Gujarat. So he has achieved something by standing out from the rest of the VR surgeons in his area, and he's providing ROP services which was never there. So coming to what we love, which is our passion, what we are good at, making it our profession, and being paid for it also kind of reinforces our choice for our profession. So we have multiple expectations from life. What expectations they can be? It can be monetary expectations. It can be an expectation of having a teaching career. You may expect to become a researcher and want to do research and get a fulfilling career in that, or your expectation in that may be charitable work. So these expectations drive our mission in choosing our career. Then coming to what the world needs or what our community needs. So when we look at charitable centers or charitable surgeries, what we do, it can be really gratifying to see the joy and the compassion that you feel after giving so much of joy to a patient who can finally see after being visually debilitated for many years due to a simple cataract. It can be quite gratifying. So what the world needs and our own love, passion, our mission in life, our profession, being paid for it, being good at it, can finally become what the world needs in the larger picture. So coming to the last part of my talk, some nuggets are: we should decide when to settle. We should have the correct attitude towards fellowship because it's an investment for future. We should not hurry to settle into practice. There are many misconceptions that you should, go straight into the market, go straight into practice and start your own setup. So this is an incorrect attitude. Investment in your education and investment in your professional learning goes a very long way. Just 1 year more or even 18 months more, extending your fellowship, as in 2 years of fellowship plus 6 months plus 1 year or 18 months in the institution where you're working, never harms you. It's a very small investment in the long professional career of almost 3 decades. So it is very worth investing that amount of time in learning ourselves and developing academic interest and enthusiasm to keep updating ourselves. So once we get into practice, it's very difficult to go for fellowships in India or abroad. It's very difficult to take a break from practice and go in for a fellowship in between these high yielding first few years of practice when we are trying to make a name for ourselves. Coming to another very important part, that is finances, we need to have it figured out largely. First few years of the practice will be only to break even and not for profit. There are many family commitments that we need to look into. There are loans to repay. So finances should be figured out largely. Coming to family support, the spouse should be willing to understand that there are many years needed for training, and this may result in this era of long distance relationships. This is my husband on a video call looking at my young daughter, and you may have to end up living apart from very young children and missing out on their early childhood years. So this is an example of this Venn diagram that I found very relevant for this talk. So what do I love? Suppose I love pediatric ophthalmology, cornea, refractive surgery, and it's getting confusing for me to choose what I want to do. These are my passions. So this is included in this Venn diagram. What am I good at? I'm good at dealing with kids. I'm surprisingly good at making a posterior capsulorhexis. I'm also very good at assessing squints and arriving at a correct diagnosis. I have seen residents making diagnosis of dissociated vertical deviations and skew deviations. And this can be part of my profession. What can I be paid for? Nobody is going to pay me for a great diagnosis of DVD or a skew deviation. What I can be paid for rather is management of strabismus, management of amblyopia, helping children with specific learning disabilities. This is something I can be paid for, especially in this time of liaisons with psychiatrists and psychologists, helping children holistically, especially with those having learning disabilities. Vision is a very important thing, so that I can be paid for, and that can also be my vocation because I want to help children come out of SLDs. What is my mission? It can be to visually empower all children. What the world needs or what your community needs is a pediatric ophthalmology department in a decrepit government medical college, and this in turn can be your vocation. So all this can be something contributory to Ikigai. In case you're wondering what Ikigai is, This is a Japanese concept referring to having a direction or purpose in life, having a sense of, and towards which persons can make actions which gives them satisfaction and a sense of meaning. This is the Ikigai book. So I will use the Ikigai concept again to help a resident choose a fellowship. So what I love is retina and uvea. I have a passion for uveal diagnostics and retinal surgery. What I am good at is again diagnostics and surgery. So this can be my profession. I can be paid for complex retinal surgeries, diabetic vitrectomies in my region, which has a big need for it. My local there are no VR surgeons nearby, so I can make the most of it. I can be a niche person and I can provide VR services to my community, and that is my vocation. And my mission is to get rid of diabetic retinopathy uh, problems causing irreversible blindness. So that can be my mission. So I will choose VR surgery rather than uvea for my life purpose. So that is my ikigai. So I hope I made it easy a little by answering some philosophical questions. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Apurva. That was really very nice and extremely well covered. I think for want of time, I would like to ask one question only. I don't see any questions in the chat box. The thing is, supposing there is a DNB candidate, you also run DNB programs in many institutes and you have fellowship programs as well. And the DNB candidate comes up to you and asks you that she needs help to select a topic and she's totally confused about how to select. Then what would be your steps 1, 2, 3, 4, or what would be your questionnaire for her? Can you briefly tell in a minute? Yeah.
So I'm guessing this girl is 29, 30 years, no, 28, 29 years old. So
Right.
I will help answer her questions through this chart. Okay. So what does she love? Post DNB, let me take the example of one of our own, DNBs. I will not take names. So she has done a thesis in retina. She is about 28 years old, going to get married the next year, and she loves oculoplasty. But I have seen that she's really good at retina because she's showed remarkable brilliance in retina and her thesis, and she does have a passion for it also. But can she make it her profession? So she wants to do oculoplasty because she feels that the her world, that is her community, needs oculoplasty. uh, because there are a lot of patients that come with lid tumors and pediatric ocular tumors and extraocular tumors in her medical college when she was doing her MBBS. So that made her want to treat them. So when she saw that, she decided to do something in that direction. So although retina can be her profession, it is not her vocation.
Right.
One more thing is what she can be paid for. It's a huge investment in retina, and oculoplasty needs little investment. So her passion, her profession, her vocation, and her mission is oculoplasty because this is a little unviable for retina. So that's my answer.
That's it. I think you hit the nail. Thank you very much, Dr. Purva. That was really nice. We'll go on, move forward, and move to the next talk that is by me. And I'll be speaking on clinical acumen building in VR fellowship, the art and science.
Dr. Guru Prasad is medical director of Joshi Eye Institute and has over 35 years of experience in vitreoretina. He has trained almost 35 to 40 people in retinal fellowships, and his kin or his proteges are spread all over the country and abroad, providing state-of-the-art VR services to their communities.
Thank you, Dr. Purva. I'll share my screen. Right. So here we go. Is my screen seen?
Yes, sir. You are audible also. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. So as you all know, in India, as of 21st May 2020, medical colleges are 542 in number, offering both MBBS and PG courses. Standalone PG institutes are 64 in number, and these are recognized by the National Medical Commission. But there is a lack of uniformity in the standard of training and standard of exit exams. You will agree with me that there are premier institutes which offer excellent training, but most of the other medical colleges are definitely good, but they may not match up to the standard of the premier institutes that I was talking about. The standard of training in the premier institutes is such that comprehensive ophthalmology fellowship may not be really required for all people coming out of there, but for most it is required, and that is the reason why I am giving this talk. So what is the aim of any fellowship or super specialization? It is just about gaining more and more knowledge about one specialty, repeated exposure to the same set of scenarios, doing the same tasks n number of times until it becomes second nature, repetitive exposure and adequate hands-on opportunities for surgery, adapting to technology, which is an integral part of modern medicine. And I heard a talk from Dr. G.N. Rao recently, and he was talking about the 3 T's. Mentoring is all about shaping the 3 T's, that is inherent talent, guidance, usage for technology, and exercising tenderness. This is something which impressed me a lot, and I thought of putting it in my presentation. So what is the ideal layout of a fellowship program? The first 3 months, both mentor and mentee should understand where the fellow stands. A short stint in comprehensive ophthalmology does one good. This is an opportunity to relearn basic examination skills. For example, slit lamp methods, because slit lamp examination may not be accessible freely to many students in certain medical colleges. It is either not in use, or it is covered, or it is under lock, or only the head of HOD can use it. Such stories we do here, and we have to train them with the usage of applanation tonometry and gonioscopy, which they may or may not have experience with. A dozen or 2 cataract surgeries to refresh the surgical skills after the joint fellowship is something that we also like to have as and when they join. So the bottom line I would say is, although there is the need for a specialization, one has to be a good comprehensive ophthalmologist first and a specialist next. I'm going to talk about vitreoretina fellowship as we do it in our institute. It is certainly a different type of specialty compared to other specialties. It is not taught like other specialties in residency, and usually needs to be taught from basics during fellowship. It needs weeks of practice to master basic examination techniques. The findings in the vitreous and retina are so subtle, similar, and diverse that it takes long to familiarize with even the common signs. For example, this is a case of a pseudodrusen in the first slide, drusen in the second, combined with diabetic retinopathy and hard exudates due to a CNVM in the third slide. And it takes nearly 3 months for the fellow to familiarize with these different types of yellow lesions. Safety margin for certain steps of surgery is so little that is only in the later part of residency that the resident can actually be allowed to do surgery, these steps under supervision or independently. The diagnostics and surgical equipment are prohibitively expensive, and it is difficult for most to start full-fledged solo practice. These are the peculiarities of the vitreoretina fellowship. So an aspiring vitreoretina fellow must be good at small incision cataract surgery and preferably phacoemulsification too. A high level of skill is needed in these surgeries. The fellow realizes the low safety margin during certain steps when he does a cataract surgery, and learns tissue handling as well, especially when he does a small incision cataract surgery. So cataract surgery, according to me, is the commonest and also the most difficult. A good cataract surgeon can mature into a good surgeon in any specialty, a good VR surgeon definitely. And I believe that 100 plus score during residency and a little thereafter is desirable before entering a VR fellowship, although this is not a magic number. 1 week orientation to all specialties in the institute is something that we practice in our institute, so that the student gets to know all the facilities in the institute. He meets consultants, some of them may be luminaries in their field, and getting to know the staff and fellows is another advantage. And also they learn how the departments work. Mass work in medical college hospitals is in one way amazing. Really, from 9 to 2, the short OPD time duration that they have, they see more than 1,500 patients. It's really amazing how they can see so many patients. This versus the working style of a private institute offering fellowship results in a cultural shock to most fellows. So learning and relearning is a lot of is a big exercise when they come for fellowship, especially the soft skills, the hard skills. Anyway, they will learn, but the soft skills like communication skills with the patient, with fellows, with co-workers, teamwork in harmony, without causing any disruption of work, adaptability to the different situations that they would come across, would probably be the first year of in the would probably be exercise in the first year, and in the second year probably they can go to the problem solving and creativity. These are the 5 soft skills which are very important, but there is no time boundary that it was some things have to be done only in the first year and some in the second year. Every institute has its own SOPs, and this is the long list of SOPs that uh, we have in different institutes, and ultimately it boils down to discipline. So learning discipline or the way or following the way the institute works is something that the resident has to learn. 2 examination techniques to master. I'm sorry, the left slide is missing. It was about indirect ophthalmoscopy, the most important thing that we teach students in their at least if they've not learned during residency, they have to learn in indirect ophthalmoscopy and 90D examination are the 2 examination techniques one has to master to enter into a fellowship. Detailed retinal drawing is something that we insist upon to the fellows to learn, because during examination of the retina, if they have to make a detailed drawing, they will examine every detail, and the number of hours or minutes that they spend goes a long way in their experience in learning indirect ophthalmoscopy and also to identify the lesions. And they can cross check with the seniors and understand the inverted image and get a reorientation for that. And they also realize the importance of a drawing in pneumatic retinopexy and scleral buckling surgery, and also in the follow-ups. And a drawing check by a consultant is always a must, because that is where they come to know about the mistakes that they would have committed. Orthodox methods are best and also a good priming for exams. Methodical history taking, general and ocular examination, arriving at a differential diagnosis, zeroing down to the most probable diagnosis by elimination, and manage and discussion of the management is something that is an orthodox method, and we have to probably exercise this every evening. Every fellow has to be made to present a case at least for 10-15 minutes. This exercise has to go on every day. And one thing I believe in is to be a good technician first. Every fellow has to understand the machine and use the machine. They have to indulge in usage of the machine, learn to capture fundus images, do perform FFA ICGA, learn B scan, learn to acquire OCTA, and electrophysiology. So by doing only they will understand. So that is what I call the workshop model. Practice of why, how, what, why is the why does gas expand? Why does a patient injected with gas does not have to not travel by air? How do you measure the drusen and so on? So this should be exercised at every step. Questioning is very, very important, and this way they learn the concepts and retain for long. Teaching in the OPD is something that has to be done. Point out every mistake, small or big, in the workup. Call to show a typical clinical symptom or sign. For example, this is an unmistakable picture of post-fever viral retinitis, which the student likes to learn. So also the dipping vein. This looks like a CNVM, but actually it's a secondary CNVM. MacTel has caused the CNVM in this patient. So you can see the dipping vein here, which we'd like to call the student to show. So there should be uniformity in documentation. Literature search has to be done whenever there's a rare case. An ILM drapes and also is something that I would like to call and show the student, especially when the student is new. And when there is something new or something very rare, I think a literature search should be asked for. And the next day, the patient, the student should be thorough with all the literature that is read and has to present it. For example, this is a case of optic nerve drusen, which I diagnosed as with retinitis pigmentosa, but it turned out to be optic nerve astrocytoma. So discussion in the department is very, very important with everyone else and also with the head of the department. Emphasizing importance of slit lamp examination. This is something that I want to tell, although it is basic. Somehow students, when they come into the retina department, they all just want to dilate the pupil, make the patient lie down and examine the retina and be done with it. They don't seem to bother much about anti-segment examination. Even if they examine with the slit lamp, somehow they tend to examine only the cornea, the lens, and the iris, and that's it. The conjunctiva and the rest of the bulbar conjunctiva and the lids are somehow missed. So these are examples of a trab, bleb, and a buckle, which has been missed by our students during the early part of the examination before they got mentored by us. So spending time so that nothing is missed is something that we would like to emphasize on in these patients. This was an example of a patient who did not improve after cataract surgery, excellent cataract surgery. The white opacity that you see here is something that was missed against the white background of the cataract or the mature cataract, and therefore the patient was not told earlier about the possibility of an amblyopia due to congenital corneal opacity or a corneal opacity at a younger age. So a methodical slit lamp examination is a must. And so this is what I'm trying to say is that an anterior segment examination is a compulsory exercise that the student should undergo before examining the retina. And one more thing that I like to emphasize on, the no cost and most useful test in ophthalmology. And that is, according to me, RAPD. No patient has to be left without a test of RAPD, and this fellow is penalized if they miss out on RAPD. Learning to include anterior vitreous examination on slit lamp examination is something that is not taught during MS or MD or DNB. And I think it's important for the students to understand Schaeffer's sign as a part of the slit lamp examination. Tailoring investigations based on clinical diagnosis is something that we have to practice. This should not be a senseless list of tests. HIV, for example, HIV and HBsAg test for a case of fluctuating refractive error where only blood sugar is required, or advising an MRI without testing the blood pressure in a case of papilledema where it actually might be due to an accelerated hypertension. So these are examples of unnecessary investigations. A prescription has to be neat and legible. They should not be overwriting. The name, age, date, and diagnosis has to be written clearly. There should be clear-cut instructions. For example, this physician's monitoring in case where solriamfetol is being prescribed is very, very important. Investigations that the patient needs along with this treatment, for example, that is written here, and the date of next review is also to be mentioned on the prescription pad, and this has to be very neat and legible. They should know the treatment protocol for most of the diseases that are commonly seen in the OPD. For example, this is a case of toxoplasma retinochoroiditis, for which a prescription has been beautifully written down in a very good handwriting. So they learn the treatment protocol by writing the prescriptions themselves instead of printing it. And so the importance of delaying steroids for 5 days after starting the definitive treatment with Bactrim DS and clindamycin. Importance of co-prescriptions with leucovorin, PPIs, and calcium when steroids are being prescribed, and the importance of special instructions like giving special instructions about GI disturbance in a case where clindamycin has been prescribed to rule out pseudomembranous colitis as a complication. So a reply to referring doctors also is something that is very, very important. With this patient, the student learns etiquette and art of letter writing, and also when we dictate this letter to the resident gets curious and feels like calling back the patient to see, and in the process gets to know about the importance of all the signs that I have mentioned in the letter. In the second year, the student is given a little more authority, more freedom and independent responsibility, put on peripheral postings, involved in discussions with consultants, and we also sometimes pretend to take opinions from them so that they get some confidence, and we encourage seniors to teach juniors. Video editing, I think Dr. Krishna Prasad, Dr. Srinivas Joshi will tell us more about it, the art and the science. A sense of involvement in the surgery and understanding the steps of surgery will probably come when he's interested with the work of video editing. Community work is mandatory according to me, because this is an opportunity to exercise skills, both clinical and surgical. The student gets independent charge of patients, which adds to their confidence. The sheer number of surgeries that are available for achieving perfection is possible. They learn the ground reality of the socioeconomic status of the majority of the patients in the camps, and they inculcate compassion and empathy. So Professor G.N. Rao, whom I heard recently, less than a month ago, on YouTube, said, empower them with the three H, that is hands, head, and heart. So empathy is very, very important. So first and foremost, this probably should have been the first slide. Like Dr. Apurva already said, they should love the specialty. You can't flog an unwilling horse, but good mentors can make them fall in love. And with the warning, I would like to leave you all and close my talk. The warning is from Nicholas Butler, American philosopher. An expert is one who knows more and more about less and less until he knows absolutely everything about nothing. So thank you very much. Yeah.
That was brilliant. Should we have questions now or at the end?
I think we can have it now. Dr. Krishna Prasad is there. I think he will be having some questions. I'll stop share.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You can have the questions in the end, sir.
1 minute. Let me stop share.
Time?
Yeah, we have time.
We have a lot of time actually.
We have time till 12:55. So
Yeah.
Stop, sir. No problem.
Have a
Can I go next, sir?
Stop sharing.
So,
Mute. Yes, sir, you're muted.
Before you start, Krishna Prasad, I would like to take 1 minute of your time. Please stop sharing. Please stop sharing, and I will share my screen to introduce you to the audience. So Dr. Krishna Prasad is a former member, South Zone ARC. He is the Director Academics, MM Joshi Eye Institute, Hubli, since 26 years. He's a gold medalist both in MBBS and PG, and PG was from the RP Center, AIMS. He's a household name among students and synonymous with PG teaching. He's won several best teacher awards. He's active. He takes active part in public education through electronic and social media. He's a self-made man, excellent in phacosurgery, glaucoma, oculoplasty, and pediatric ophthalmology. And I think being the master of masters or the teacher of teachers is the right person for faculty for this IC. Dr. Krishna Prasad, please.
thank you, sir, for that generous introduction. I'll make justice to the introduction. So I'll be speaking on the communication aspect as well as the art of holistic prescription for a postgraduate or a resident. I think the post-graduation are the best days of anybody's life. Normally, PGs look into somebody who is a successful practitioner, always envy them. But believe me, this is the best time where you have a lot of fun and you have your best day where you can really, create a very good foundation for the edifice of your professional career. And I always say the success lies on three things: the knowledge, the exemplary, usable, contemporary, or relevant knowledge of ophthalmology that you take and keep upgrading every time, and the skills that are very important that you imbibe during your post-graduation or mentorship, and the attitude. Knowledge and skills can come from the environment, can from the influences, mentors, books, other resources, but attitude is something that is inborn, something you're born with, and that is nobody can actually change it. And probably that is the very important thing for a successful practice. I think the whole idea of any kind of a residency is to create an expert from a novice. I think this continues into our lifetime. I think what is very important is the communication. I think it's always said that the good communicators get into less trouble in life, also in professional life. I think this is a communication is one area which is not in our curriculum, and somebody who's a good communicator as such probably thinks. So let us kind of see how things can go every. Like this is a PG who's just in the OPD. An unsuspecting patient walks in and she's busy with talking to her friend, chit-chatting, and she's not even really caring what this man is all about. So she again gets distracted. The man is left in the lurch. So finally, he continues. So she has forgotten what she asked in the first place. Again, she has forgotten what she saw in the first place. So the man is making an impression of the clinician. And probably he will never visit her at the whole mahalla, the entire his, he will never recommend her to anybody. So this is just an example of how a communication can go wrong and how we can actually mess up the whole patient-doctor relationship. I think breaking the bad news is something very important. See, when you are having a case where you have to really tell some unpleasant thing, so you need to really, have some kind of empathy, put yourself in that place. Just an example of how somebody who comes with a problem. So no appropriate facial expression, no body language, which really can be appeared as compassionate. So she blurts out that she has an infection. So the patient is just snubbed into the thing. So breaking the bad news, like there's a case of retinoblastoma needing enucleation. There could be a bilateral advanced, glaucoma, where the patient has already really gone blind, and then you need to take care of him. Or it could be a posterior segment pathology, post-cataract. You are not really prognosticated very well, but the patient has not gained much vision, contrary to his expectation. And how do you actually counsel him? Or basically, let's say child who is born with a microphthalmos or with some serious problem, how do you really counsel the parents? I think these are examples where it can really, the patients. And what is very important is an operating room. The silence is golden. I think the lesser you talk, the better it is. The people talking in very high pitch, high volume, or talking surgery, or speaking even relevant things on a mobile phone actually makes the patient think that probably we are not doing the job in the right way. So patient probably will not pardon us for whatever could be the reason why we are talking so loudly, which is not in any way connected with this surgery. I think it's very important to keep the volume low, not to talk anything during the surgery. That is very important. At the same time, not to allow anything that the patient can be misconstrued. For example, if you are asking for an intraocular lens, power is not available for some reason. And if the OT assistant say that power is not available, and the patient hears it, whatever you may do, but the patient will still go with the idea that probably something right has not been done. Probably the lens was not available, something else should have been done. Or the kind of things that happen now. Just watch, there is a surgery training happening. So the communication happens in the local language, the patient can understand. We're not technical about it. We're not telegraphic. We are, trying to put blame games. We are
Sir, your voice is breaking. You're not audible.
The internet perhaps is not strong enough. KP sir, your video is not moving and the yeah.
fix the things in a way that. Okay. What about now, sir?
Better, better.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the common foot in the mouth syndrome, like you speak the local language, that is the problem. You can always, the avoidable conversations, that is something that again is create problems, and phone calls and instructions to the assisting staff, and always a surgical training situations where, you are sometimes in a fit of panic, you try to kind of make the patient anxious about it. At the same time, wrong jargon or using a lack of empathy, it can create problems to the patient. So I think communication skills is the cornerstone of our professional success. And it's always said that the success lies in the Broca's area. So you need to watch people. I think just like anything else, how you watch your operations in the operating room on the monitor, you also have to watch the stalwarts in their outpatient, how they counsel, how they communicate, how they make a patient understand the procedure, or how they actually solve problems or doubts. You also have to rehearse in front of the mirror. You need to kind of emulate the stalwarts or your mentors. And sometimes this is something that has a very serious thing that people have to practice. I think breaking bad news is something that's very, very important. And coming to the prescription, Dr. Guru Prasad has already alluded to in some form how a prescription has to be. The aim is to communicate very clearly, no confusions allowed, legible handwriting, and instructions has to be in the local language. Many a times we write HS, BID, TD, or whatever SOS, which nobody can understand. And even you write in the English for a patient who cannot read English. So it has to be in a language the patient can understand. It's also important how many bottles the patient may be coming after 4 months. If you write one bottle, he may exhaust it and it may not be available in his place. So number of tablets, if you are prescribing a tapering dose of steroids, how many tablets are required, and any additional instruction. I think Dr. Guru Prasad showed some very important pro forma how a prescription has to be. And please write locally available medications. Many a times the postgraduates work in different places, in different institutions, and what is locally available, that medication, something has to be written. Sound alike drugs, extra GAT, extra lube can be confusing, and always write the name, age, date, the MRD number, and you have to write your seal signature with the registration number, preferably with a seal, and any adjuvant prescription like steroids or any kind of supplements. Steroids, for that you need to give some anti-acidity measures. And what is very important is to teach back technique. You tell the patient, can you tell me what I have told you? Many times we come to know that how bad we have communicated. The patient hasn't understood anything, he has just nodded. So teach back is an excellent way of knowing what we have done. I think with this is an area where any postgraduate has to really work hard, because that builds up the confidence in their practice, and communication goes a long way, very long way in trying to create a successful career, and they have to make a name for themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. KP. I think as expected, your talk has always been good, and as expected today also it was excellent. You covered everything. There's nothing more to add, and for the information of the audience, Dr. Krishna Prasad is an excellent speaker when it comes to communication. So he is a good communicator, and when it comes to teaching communication also, he is excellent. He's very good, and I think he did a very good job today. Any other inputs from Apurva or Srinivas?
Yes, sir. I have a question for KP, sir. Excellent talk, sir. So I'll give you an example of what happened to me recently. There was an 89-year-old gentleman. He came to my clinic with vein occlusion in one eye. His other eye was lost due to glaucomatous optic atrophy, and we share that patient. You also are a carer for him, and so am I. I mean, he came for the first time to me, and I checked his blood pressure. It was 200 by 110 or something. And I told him that his vein occlusion is related to his blood pressure. And I wrote a letter, a very lucid letter to the physician. Since he was 89 years old, I called up the physician and said, so and so is coming to your clinic. Please see him out of turn. He's a very old gentleman. And I made sure I called the physician in front of this patient. So now the patient has gone to him. He knows I have helped him. I've given my phone number to the patient, telling him, you call me if you have any problems getting into the clinic. So now this happened. He even called me from the clinic. I thought everything was, fine, and everything was solved. And I was feeling very proud of myself for going out of my way to help him. I managed to run into him sitting outside your OT waiting to be taken in. And I spoke to him and I said, how are you? I was expecting a very smiling sort of conversation. And he ended up saying, oh, you are Apurva. You know what? You sent me to that doctor. You wasted my time. I told the doctor, she saw my blood pressure, so it became 200 by 110. She made me so tensed. And I'm never going to her again. I came with some problem. She sent me to some doctor. I have मैंने बोल दिया I'll never come to you again. I'll tell everybody never to consult you again. So when I have gone out of my way, I think, and I've helped him, and honestly, I didn't feel bad. He was a very old gentleman. But how would you take this? You've gone out of your way. You've used your brokers to the maximum. Now the patient says this. What should you do?
I think gratitude is a virtue which you cannot expect from everyone in this world. I think that is something very important. There are always thankless jobs. Medical profession is one. And any patient's personal opinion about any treatment is shaped by so many things. Okay, it may not be based on reality. It may be based on their own perceptions of the things. I think everybody is free to choose their perception, even though you have done your best. The patient may perceive it in a totally convoluted way, and it is shaped by so many things, their preset prejudices, biases, and so many other things. I think what is important is you do your job as long as your conscience is okay with it, as long as you're doing a job that you think that is the right thing to do. I think there's never a wrong time to do the right thing, and don't expect patients to be grateful. The loyalty and gratitude is a virtue, okay, which you cannot expect every time. It is a bonus.
You froze, sir. You froze. Okay.
I think that can make your life more comfortable. I think there are definitely two things like this in your practice that you can remain grounded.
Yes, sir. Yes. We have a lot of time, almost 25 minutes to go. I have one question for Guru sir.
Yeah.
So,
No, we have two talks also.
Two talks, okay.
Yeah. No, you can ask the question.
Guru
Because
sir,
my talk will be only 5 minutes.
I'm a chief instructor in the other thing. Can you kind of?
Yeah, please. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you
KP.
so much.
You're very well done. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, Apurva.
Okay, sir. So, since you've provided a holistic fellowship, and I'm a witness to that, and despite all your efforts, all your teachings, somebody doesn't learn, and they go out to practice, and you're feeling a little apprehensive about how they're going to serve their community. Do you do anything about it?
Yeah, we try to retain these students for longer. We try to tell them that they're not trained enough and would probably need more training. In spite of that, if some of them want to leave, I think it is their fate. We can't change their fate, I think. But at the same time, yes, as the concern that you have shown is probably the impression that others will have about our institute, about the alma mater. which is also a major thing of concern. I think that is something which we have to swallow sometimes. But then there's very little that we can do to change people. 2 years is long enough, and if they don't agree for another 3 months or 6 months to continue the fellowship, then we'll have to probably face the consequences. Yeah. So we'll move on now because we have 2 talks, but then my talk will be just about 5 minutes. So I give Srinivas the liberty of taking up to 20 minutes. This is Dr. Srinivas Joshi, MS FERS from Toronto Western University. Also, he's recently been awarded the Fellow of the American Society of Retina Specialists. He's presently the member South Zone ARC. Director Research and Community Services, M. Joshi Eye Institute, Hubli, since 9 years now. A prolific vitreoretinal surgeon, trained by some of the best teachers in the world like Dr. Wai Ching Lam, Dr. Peter Curtis, and Dr. Robert Dehuni. A skilled VR surgeon, habitual winner at international conferences, first Indian to win 4 international Best Video Awards back to back, first Indian to receive honorary fellow of ASRS, as I just mentioned. He's a prominent public figure as part of many organizations already at this age, and all these qualities probably make him ideal for today's IC. With this introduction, I request Dr. Srinivas to please continue with his talk. Yeah.
Thank you, Guru sir. So my today's talk will be on step-by-step surgical approach for the fellowship. So I'll be focusing more on the VR fellowship. So as I said now, as I'm saying now, Guru is the most important thing which any fellow or the learner should have in their life. And I'm lucky to have both these together, Guru Prasad. So thank you, sir. You have been most important person in my life for the motivation and kind of support you give to all fellows and juniors like me. Thank you very much. And thank you for involving me in your IC, and along with Dr. Apurva and Dr. Krishna Prasad. So Dr. Apurva asked a question regarding that patient. One thing I would like to tell Apurva is, Apurva, we also have to be a good patientologist. So that's the new subject. That is because many physicians are unaware of the behavioral and the psychological aspects of their patients. And that translates the physician's interest into the patient into the actual practice of medicine. And a newly designated field of medicine, which can be called as patientology, should also be established. But I don't think you should regret it. And in one or the other way, she will regret and she will come back to you. That's what I have seen in my 10 years of practice. So I'll not go into the details. So timeline for the starting the fellowship is the first 2 months, 3 months. You can divide it from 3 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 18, and 18 to 21. So in the first 2 months, I think most of the things Guru sir has already covered it, is observing in the clinic. You have to be a very good observant. A good observation is half done. And also try to shadow the seniors, like you can follow the senior colleagues or your senior fellows also, and try to follow the protocols. And one thing which Dr. Guru Prasad sir always used to tell me is, first, if you have not practiced well with IDEO, then make a dot like this, right? Make a dot like this and then try to focus your 20D. This should come to the rim of your 20D. And that is how you can start learning right from the wet lab training to doing it on the patients. Then, of course, the intravitreal basics injections, he has told it about the lasers and everything. So IDEO examination, what I feel is very, very important. The first 3 months, you should know about detecting the peripheral lattices, indented examinations, and majority of the things. And this is one thing which Guru Prasad sir always suggests is, while giving intravitreal injection, try to wear a loop in the initial few days so that you can get a magnified view. So in the 3 months, once your OT posting starts, so it's always better to get oriented with the OT. And most important thing I would like to suggest our dear colleagues or juniors is, try to learn the system first. So learn the machine. Most of the time I have seen, even after 6 months, they try to fumble to press, which is the fluid air exchange button. So they try to get confused. So it's always important to first learn the vitrectomy machine, whatever you are using, and try to learn assist, especially in case of indentation, basic imaging, or electrophysiology, which is basic imaging picture, the electrophysiology. These are all the things we should finish it off within the first 3 months of your fellowship. And coming to the next is between 3 to 6 months, once you start going to the OR and you are pretty much oriented with the things and set up in the institution you follow, is always better to follow that. And this is a slit lamp laser examination. You should start pretty soon. And again, the ports, coming to the ports, I would like to go directly. You can see this video here. Of course, you know that well better, 3.5 mm in pseudophakic and 4 mm in phakic. What I suggest to my young juniors is not to use any forceps in these kind of cases. Even if you want to, then you can catch hold of the cannula, not the conjunctiva. And the placement of the trocar always has to be important. It has to be tangential, parallel to the limbus first. We have a guide there, and once it stops there, then turn it perpendicular, and your direction has to be in the center of the vitreous cavity. So that is how you can see here, there was absolutely no blood, no touching of any of the conjunctiva, tearing of the conjunctiva, and that's how it's always better if you start with. And second thing is placing and knowing the infusion is always better, right? So once you put in that infusion, you should always check for it. This was done by our fellow, and inadvertently it went into the subretinal space and it caused a CDs as well. So immediately I went ahead and did the choroidal detachment, and the choroidal detachment settled very well, and then went ahead with vitrectomy. So the next is again, as I said here, this was again recently operated just 2 days back. You can see here the infusion, they checked it, and you can see the retina underneath that. So this is not the right way to go ahead, remove it, and again place it. This also had a CD. So it's always better to go in for the 6 mm cannula in these cases. That always prevents the intravitreal fluid or the fluid coming from the infusion to go into subretinal space or the suprachoroidal space. So another important thing in the initial few days of your OR is doing a silicone oil removal. Most of the fellows think that, oh, what is this? They gave me silicone oil removal, I didn't do any vitrectomy. In fact, to tell you, my dear fellows, silicone removal is a very skillful surgery. It's not just removing the silicone oil actively. What you need to do here is to remove it completely as much as possible. Of course, it is impossible to remove 100% of the silicone oil droplets. So what we suggest is to do a skimming method. See, silicone oil is lighter than water. It floats. So it is at the interface between the air and the water. That is where you have to place your cutter and try to remove this oil. You can see how the silicone oil is coming to the infusion, to the cutter. So making it, see, in case you operated in a case of 6/9 vision or 6/6 patient had vision, if they had a minimal droplets remaining, and they'll be the most unhappy patients. So removal of the silicone oil, doing it meticulously, doing a skimming procedure properly, and try to remove as much as silicone oil droplets is the key to a successful silicone oil surgery, removal surgery. Then laser endophotocoagulation is always an important thing. So you need to know the judgment where you place your laser. You need not to be too close to the retina nor far away from the retina. Otherwise, you will not cause sufficient burns. What I suggest to our young colleagues is try to mark it first. Whenever you are doing a PRP, at the temporal part of the macula, try to mark it. And over the disc also, on the nasal part of the disc, try to mark it. Inadvertently, accidentally, you don't try to step inside. So marking while doing a complete PRP is very, very important. And of course, it's not a difficult job. Once you get a good orientation, once you get a good hands-on, once you know that you have a good tissue handling, you can do these procedures pretty easily. Coming to the next, this is again a patient of the coloboma surgery, where the PFCL can be used. You can use it up to the edge of the break and then try to complete as much as possible under the PFCL itself. Nevertheless, you can do it under the air, but visualization might get compromised sometimes. So better to do it under PFCL. So vitrectomy as a systematic approach is very important. Actually, the core vitrectomy is nowadays the book says it's an erroneous concept because it was performed when it was with a rotational cutter, according to Steve Charles. But nowadays we have modern cutters, high cut rate, fast fluidics, linear suction. So AVC can be retained, especially in case of phakics. The anterior vitreous cortex can be retained, and so that the cataract formation will not happen very fast. And especially you can avoid fogging in case of patients where you do a posterior capsulotomy. So this is another video where you can do a good vitrectomy. But one thing my mentor used to say is doing vitrectomy is not like stirring the stirrer in the cup of tea or when you mix it with the sugar. It has to be done meticulously. You have to go systematically around it. Wait for the time until the vitreous comes to your cutter. I have seen many of the fellows just going around and around in the vitreous cavity. That's not the proper way. Wait for some time until the vitreous comes to your cutter. So then you'll have a good peripheral vitrectomy. Then again, in 6 to 12 months, you can start doing a band buckle independently and try to perform PVD. Understanding the architecture of the vitreous, its attachment to the retina is very key in inducing the PVD. And initially, we always suggest to use an IVTA. It's a good stain for you to see, and always try to induce it around the disc first. Look at the margin. Sometimes I have seen that they hold the cutter opposite to the disc margin, opposite to the rim of the attachment. That way the vitreous is not going to come to your cutter. Holding it exactly when you have to feed that rim of that vitreous which is attached to the disc so that you can peel it very easily with high vacuum. Now in 12 to 18 months, then of course you can start doing a base shaving, basics of ILMP, tackling the membrane. And this while injecting a PFCL, one more thing is very important is try to direct that injection towards the disc. Don't try to do it on the papillomacular bundle. You're going to damage it. And secondly, don't put it away from above. Go inside the bubble and inject it slowly. In that way, you will have a uniform PFCL bubble. Sometimes injecting from the top, you'll have multiple bubbles and it will be disturbing. And always try to inject it till the edge of the break. Here you can see there was a retinectomy done in this case here, and the PFCL was injected up till the break. So coming to the epiretinal membranes, Robert Mashimer first started the ERM peeling, forceps membrane peeling. Try to get oriented with different kind of forceps you have. I have seen many of the fellows doing it with the serrated forceps, doing an ILM peeling. You have an ILM forceps, you have an end grasping forceps. You can use that to do it a much better job. So ILM peeling, again, you can do it at around 8 to 12 months or after 1 year, you can start doing it. Most importantly, try to use these Challam lenses or the flat lenses, because you get a good depth perception and orientation will be much better. You get a good magnification also. And once you have that, you know that you are pretty much stable in your hands and you're confident of doing the initial steps of the surgery, you can venture into doing, this was the surgery done by our fellow, where you can see systematically trying to remove the membrane. Most important, one thing I would like to tell all my dear fellows is just removing the membrane is not important. Leaving the membrane is very important, because you should know when to leave. Otherwise, you will pick the retina. See here, so nicely that fellow is trying to re-grasp it, again come back, re-grasp it, pull, again come back, re-grasp it, pull. So in this way, you can have a complete sheet of ILM once together, rather than multiple times you are trying to pick it up. That might damage the retina. And again, sometimes when you have an RD like this and later on you want to do an ILM peeling, instead of removing the PFCL, you can always stain the retina under the PFCL, but make sure that you use very less ILM BBG in these cases. So next is segmentation and cutter delamination, cutter scissor delamination. There are two techniques, outside in technique or inside out technique. Guru sir, in 2 minutes, I'll finish. Outside in technique or inside out technique, whichever technique you want, you can go ahead. Outside in was done by Robert Mashimer, and inside out, in fact, is always better, because the central retina is always thicker, and you can try to pull as much thick as membrane from the centrally and then go periphery as much as possible. So there are various types of segmentations and delamination. Here you can see the most important thing, which I would like to tell all my colleagues, junior colleagues, is try to do a proper peripheral surgery first, peripheral vitrectomy surgery first. So it's nothing but doing a 360-degree truncation. So once you do that, see, you try to detach the connection from the periphery to these membranes. Once you do that, then you can tackle these membrane very easily. And you can see this whole surgery was done by the cutter itself. And Dr. Guruprasad sir always used to explain to us during my fellowship how to do a segmentation. Segmentation is nothing but when you have a bridge with two columns, cutting across the bridge is called as segmentation. When you cut at the pole of the bridge, it is called as delamination. Here you can see I'm trying to break this membrane into multiple pieces. Like how we do a phacoemulsification, how we do a multiple pieces of the nucleus and then try to divide it. Similar way you can see here multiple pieces can be made, and then easily with the help of the vacuum, you can start doing the delamination. There can be a conformal delamination, cutter delamination, fold back delamination. You can use multiple techniques once you are thorough with, and thanks to these modern gauge cutters, which does most of these jobs. And again, ROP laser is very important. Once you are after first year of your this thing, you can start doing an ROP laser. And then lensectomy, I'll not go into the detail of this. Fluid air exchange is again a very important technique. Here you can see. And most importantly is once you start doing the fluid air exchange, go near the highest point of the break first. Yes, I'm almost finishing. Try to get the air as much as possible up to the break at the highest level of the break. See here, the retinectomy was done. And in these cases, especially in these giant retinal tears, all care has to be taken because you want to avoid slippage. And then come to the disc. I've seen many of the fellows, once it comes to the edge, they directly jump on the disc. By this way, definitely there will be a subretinal fluid coming underneath. So always try to drain up till the edge of it. See here, up till the edge of it, and then come to the disc on the posterior pole. So silicone oil injection is last 1 or 2 videos I want to show is once you're doing a silicone oil, the important thing I want to show here is you can see here, you can slightly inject more so that it goes into the infusion. Because sometimes when you remove this, there might be a leakage, especially when we use these trocars multiple times, there can be some leakage. So once you remove this trocar, now you can see here, the silicone oil starts coming down because that much of oil is lost, and that oil is going to compensate and come inside. So by this technique, you will avoid underfill of the oil, neither the overfill. If there is overfill, it goes back into this infusion. So if these underfill, it comes back. So this way you can avoid overfilling or underfilling, and you can see the optimum filling in this eye. So I would like to show my last slide is once you are comfortable with doing most of these surgeries, you can go ahead, try to induce the PVD. See here, this was again a recent surgery. I just wanted to show it where you can induce a PVD or do the membrane peeling just with the help of the cutter itself. After 18 months or 2 years, once you know that you are doing a good surgery, then you can go ahead with the cutter itself, because as I said, the cutter does most of the job. But don't hesitate. Like I want to show this last video. In this video, don't try to do heroics with the cutter itself, because sometimes we might get tear because of the high cut rate and the vacuum. We might involve the retina and try to do a retinal tears. So here you can see whenever it comes to periphery, or you see that the membrane is very tightly at the end, never hesitate to shift bimanually. Use a good chandelier illumination and try to use a good the scissors, and intermittently you can cut it with the cutter itself. But always you can see here, there's almost a sclerotic retina. The retina is very thin in the periphery. The vessels are sclerosed there. So in these cases, it's always better to use bimanual because you have control while peeling this membrane. And then you can do a proper base shaving after injecting the PFCL. Of course, PFCL does act like a third hand as well. And then under the PFCL, you can laser most of these breaks. So lastly, in case if you don't remove the PFO properly, this is how it happens, the subretinal PFO. And again, you have to use a 42 gauge needle to remove this PFO. So it's always better try, because PFO is colorless. It's not just at the disc, even at the posterior staphyloma, that is where the PFO might be remaining. So make sure that you do a complete PFO removal whenever at the end of the surgery when you want to remove it. So I would like to acknowledge Department of Retina, my colleagues, Dr. Apurva and Dr. Suresh, my mentor, Dr. Guru Prasad, and our dear fellow, Dr. Karthike and Dr. Giriraj, who has helped me in giving these videos back to me. Thank you very much once again, sir.
That was really nice, Srinivas.
Thank you, sir.
We covered the entire gamut of vitreoretinal surgery. Dr. Apurva, would you like to add or comment on the fellowship program, how we should be for the surgical aspect of the fellowship program? Yeah.
First, Srinivas sir can answer. Which is the first surgery you give for independent surgery, where you tell you go and do, I'm not coming? You have options. One is it endophthalmitis, Second, vitrectomy plus frag in a patient where IOL is already placed in a rent. IOL is there, only vitrectomy plus frag. Or third, vitreous hemorrhage in a phakic patient. Which is the
Yes,
first?
of course, I would like to give vitrectomy with frag first because there's always a pseudophakia. And initially, because they have to get oriented with the phakic lens. Although second choice would be giving a vitreous surgery in the phakic patient, but when the lens is already placed, it is pretty much stable, then it's always easier for them to go ahead, do a vitrectomy and then do the frag.
Okay. Guru sir, what is
Last?
okay? What is your opinion on giving endophthalmitis surgeries to fellows?
I think endophthalmitis ideally should be done by a consultant, and that too an experienced consultant. The best person in the department should do an endophthalmitis surgery, because that is something which is a very serious situation. That is something that has that needs a lot of skill. That is something that needs a lot of attention to minor details. For example, membranes on the retina, the necrosis, and differentiating this necrosis from the epiretinal membranes that might have formed. Sometimes it is so difficult to differentiate between membranes and the necrotic retina that only an experienced hand can actually differentiate it. And under the compromised visibility, I think sometimes it becomes very, very difficult, even with experienced hands, whether to do base shaving or not, whether to first of all putting the infusion, starting from the infusion itself, there are difficulties, because the vitreous base area, the infusion will not be seen. So how to overcome that problem is something that an experienced surgeon only will be able to do. So these are all problems which probably warrant that an experienced surgeon only should do. But depending, that can depend. It can depend on the severity of the infection. If the vitreous is not that hazy, if it is an early endophthalmitis, if you feel that the disc is seen and the vessels are seen, perhaps a senior fellow who is about to complete his fellowship can take it up. But when it comes to severe endophthalmitis, I think the best person in the department has to do it to save the eye.
Is there for more questions, sir? You are talk?
Yeah, he has
5
another
minutes.
talk of 5
I
minutes.
have a short talk. Yeah. Can I share the screen?
Yes, sir, please.
Thank you, Srinivas. We'll go over to my. So I'll be speaking on non-clinical essentials, and what I mean by non-clinical essentials is something that you will realize in the course of my talk. Is my screen seen?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. So what after fellowship? During fellowship, they would have learned the hard skills and the soft skills. But after fellowship, they would probably join either a medical college in government or private, or join an institute like ours or a corporate hospital, or they may enter into solo practice. The problem comes only when they enter into a solo practice, because that is where they somehow get flummoxed or stumped by certain problems that they would not have learned during their fellowship. And that is the purpose of this presentation, to make them learn, or to add in the curriculum certain things which they should learn before they start their solo practice. So management skills is something to begin with. How to recruit a receptionist, a housekeeping assistant, an OPD assistant, a counselor, OT nurse, CSSC staff. All these are basic requirements to start a solo practice. And how to conduct an interview, what questions to ask in the interview, whether where the previous employment was, do a background check and all that. And as the practice grows, they probably will have to hire managers and accountants, and how to go about it in a phased manner. Training of staff is something that they have to learn. Whenever there's a training program going on in their alma mater, they have to attend the program, so that they also learn how to train the staff. Dealing with mediocrity and blunders done by the staff, that is very, very important, because this is a very delicate issue. Identifying the strengths and weaknesses of staff for proper selection and the proper portfolio allocation is something that is important to know. And the knowledge about the labor law is also important. Procuring licenses to start practice, applying for memberships and buying indemnity. I think medical indemnity is something that is very, very essential in the present day of litigations, and therefore I think that is also important. Certain aspects about finance management, bookkeeping, payments and receipts, and it is better to learn MS Excel, if not Tally. Tally would be the best, but MS Excel at least. Cash management, taxes is something which is very, very important. GST, they should know about GST, income tax laws, professional tax exemptions. They should take the full benefit of tax exemptions. Every single pie that is spent as a professional expense has to be documented, even if it is cash payment. Depreciation, they should have a knowledge about, and etc. Building up a capital account for new equipment, upgradation, maybe upgradation to bigger, better equipment or better place of practice, and expansion and so on. And how to save, how to invest, and how to invest wisely is something that they have to learn. About store and inventory, I think I'll not go into the details. It is enough to just to read out these the points written there. The supply source, they would, when they enter into a private practice, they would not know where to buy viscoat from, where to buy viscoelastic from, where to buy the lenses from. So I think it is important for them to go to the store in the alma mater and ask the storekeeper about all these details. They should learn about storekeeping, indents and purchases, inventory, inward, outward, and everything. Monthly stock, opening stock, closing stock, all this they have to learn. First in, first out, keeping a tab on the expiry date, sorting of drugs look alike and sound alike, preservation of consumables, especially our injections, the Accentrix, ranibizumab, the intravitreal injections that we use have all to be maintained at a low temperature, and refrigerator temperature maintenance and maintenance of the refrigerator itself is something that they have to learn. Most importantly, it is working of the CSSD. They should learn. Just one more minute. Working of CSSD is something that we have to teach them. For example, cleaning of instruments, protecting tips of delicate instruments, ETO, steam autoclave, the different processes of drying, packing, and sterilization, either by autoclave or by ETO, have to be learnt by the fellow before they leave the institute. Troubleshooting common problems with equipment, listen carefully to instructions during any installation of the machine that happens. They have to be very, very alert, and they have to involve themselves with technicians and OT personnel. Managing a difficult patient is something that is a topic by itself, and we can have a 1 hour session on this. Basically, the 3 points that are important are hearing him out, because he or she wants to vent out his feelings. Empathizing is something that we have to do, and keeping cool throughout is another thing that we have to exercise. Marketing is also important, because he's just started and he would like to make some money. Making his presence felt good, have a good rapport with local practitioners. Memberships of all associations have to be sought. Giving awareness lectures and seize every opportunity in print, electronic, and social media. But the most powerful tool, I believe, is happy patients. And these happy patients are the ones who will probably spread the word of mouth, spread the good word about you, and bring more patients for you. So Professor G.N. Rao, again, I would like to quote, he says there are 3 types of practitioners: clinicians and academicians, ophthalmic managers and ophthalmic leaders. Ophthalmic leaders are the one with vision, like Professor G.N. Rao himself. And I think we can be good clinicians and academicians. Some of us can become ophthalmic managers, but very few can become ophthalmic leaders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Time is up.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the chairperson and to all the speakers out there. Quite an informative session it was.
Thanks
Thank
to
you so
all
much,
the
and
panelists.
have a great day ahead.
Thank you, Guru sir. You
Thank you.
covered the fellowship right from day 0 to all the 24 months or even 36 months. You covered it completely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.